Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Best Pope ever, raved the news channel MSNBC. World's greatest father, echoed Jon Stewart. So just what has got liberal commentators excited about this pontiff who's been ensconced in the Vatican for barely 6 months? Well, it followed the first major interview of his papacy. Pope Francis told the Jesuit magazine La Civiltà Cattolica that the church is too focused on preaching about abortion, gay people and contraception and needed to be more merciful. He warned that the church's moral structure could fall like a house of cards unless it changed, adding that the church must show balance and heal wounds. It comes on the eve of his first crucial meeting with a group of 8 cardinals from around the world who are to be his permanent consultants. 2 months ago, he spoke about gay priests during an impromptu news conference on a return flight from Brazil. He said it was not up to him to judge the sexual orientation of clergy as long as they were searching for God and had goodwill. But he has had a mixed response. Some clergy in the United States have expressed disappointment that he has not pressed church teaching on abortion, contraception and homosexuality. But the Archbishop of New York, Cardinal Timothy Dolan, described the pontiff's interview as magnificent and even called him a breath of fresh air. He's also struck a surprisingly conciliatory tone towards atheists and agnostics, saying that God would forgive them as long as they behaved morally and lived according to their consciences. Many commentators have leapt upon these comments as a sign that the church is modernising and that the pontiff himself is even, dare we say it, a liberal. But is this a change of tack? I'm joined on the line from Rome by Susy Hodges, who is a Vatican affairs expert, and also on the line is Kate Smurthwaite, an atheist and a comedian and activist. Here in the studio, I'm joined by Iman Abou Atta from the British multi-confessional group Faith Matters. Also here in the studio is Terry Weldon. He is a activist and writes the blog Queering the Church. Also here in the studio is Peter D. Williams, who is a speaker at the group Catholic Voices. Welcome to you all. Terry, what did you make of the interview? Do you think it signified a change of tone?
Change of tone is absolute. It's not a change of teaching. I think we must all agree on that. But the change of tone is in itself immensely important because it opens the way for a change in teaching in the longer run, most particularly by encouraging and accepting the fact that people can disagree, the openness, the refusal to judge. All of that will encourage people to speak up. Very, very different from Benedict, who had a habit of clamping down on anything that remotely resembled dissent.
Susy Hodges in Rome, what did you make of the interview that he gave? Did you think it suggested a change of tack, a change of tone?
I absolutely agree that it was a change of tone, of approach, but he's not tearing up the rule book. Catholic doctrine remains unchanged, but certainly he's trying to get a more inclusive, a more welcoming church, and I think his personal warmth, his piety, his humbleness, all these things have really struck a chord with many Catholics, even those who perhaps are not who are not practicing.
Peter Williams, he did mention things like the view of the church's teaching as a monolith to defend without nuance or different understandings is wrong. There are ecclesiastical rules and precepts that were once effective but have now lost value or meaning. This is unlike anything we've heard come out of the Vatican before. Would you agree with that?
Well, actually, I think that this whole episode, as often with many of the things that the Pope has said, this illustrates a principle in biblical theology known as a text without a context is a pretext. Because when you actually read this interview, it becomes very, very clear that the people who want to most read into the Pope's remarks, change and reform within the Catholic Church, have basically taken his remarks and run with them. So what he actually said in the interview, when you actually read it, he's talking about confession. He's talking about people coming to confession who are same-sex attracted or who are divorced Catholics, who have remarried. And he's saying that, look, when you're in that situation, the first thing you talk about, in fact, the first thing the Church talks about in general, is salvation in Christ. It's not moralism. We're not just giving people rules without a context. The context in which we talk about the moral teachings of the Church, he says in the interview, is the context of salvation in Christ. He's not changing the rules. If he were going to change the rules, he certainly wouldn't do it in an interview with a group of Jesuits. What he's doing is he's saying, look, the context of our moral teaching on abortion, whatever it be, gay marriage, whatever it is not we have these rules and you must follow them for their own sake. It's you follow these teachings in the context of salvation in Christ. So he's not at all even suggesting that we're going to change the rules or that we're going to go in a different direction or have a different tack. We actually read the interview itself, which seemingly most people aren't willing to do. They're willing to just take a snippet of what he's actually said. it's very clear that he has no intention of changing the church's teachings, but he is changing the tone. He is trying to make sure that people don't go about just sort of talking about, as I say, abortion, gay marriage, whatever kind of moralistic issue you want to talk about, outside of the context of the mercy of God, loving Christ, and salvation by Christ.
Iman Abou Atta, what do you think? Did you see some kind of change of tone, perhaps opening up more widely to other faiths?
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with already all speakers that, yeah, absolutely. It's a change of tone. It's opening up to be more inclusive to everyone. It's sending message across to different faiths, to be open to all kinds of people, no matter what your sexuality is, or no matter what your belief really is.
Kate Smurthwaite, I mean, I know you're an atheist, and so that puts you as the perfect impartial bystander in this particular debate, but I'm just wondering what you think about comments when the Pope makes. Do you think that it's a suggestion that perhaps the Church is trying to move with the times, and from your perspective, do you think that's important?
Move with the times. I mean, here we are. He's saying, he's not saying it's okay to be gay. He's not saying he's not saying that gay people can, run an important role in the Church or can have an important part in our communities. He's sort of saying it might be not the end of the world, it might not be the most important thing. It seems like we've got an organisation that historically, and even, up to very, very recently, has been incredibly, prejudiced against women, against gay people, against all these groups. And now there's a tiny little glimmer of change, not, as Peter quite rightly points out, and I never agree with Peter Williams on principle in these things, but you're quite right, Peter, that he's not actually changed any doctrine or any rules or anything like this. What he's saying is, well, the rule is still there. The rule still applies to absolutely everybody who considers themselves Catholic, but maybe it's not the most important thing. Maybe there are bigger issues we should be focusing on. And I think, okay, yes, sure, it's a change of tone, but what I'm looking for from organisations with a massive history of bigotry is not a change of tone. It's a change of policy, is actual, real. I mean, there are millions of people out there whose lives are directly affected because they don't have access to contraception. And, in particular, people who are at risk of infectious diseases, people whose families are stuck in poverty because they can't get out of the cycle of having huge families. And, these people need a lot more than a change in tone. They need somebody to actually step up and make a difference. So I'm sorry, but I see the change, and it's a tiny, tiny change, yes, in the direction of less bigoted, but I'm not really prepared to stand up and shout and scream and get excited about somebody who's been very bigoted, an organisation that's been very bigoted for a very long time, being marginally less so.
Terry Weldon, can I get your response to that? And also, furthermore to that, why has it not been welcomed by all aspects of the clergy, say, for instance, in the United States, who, according to reports, if we're to believe them, are somewhat disappointed at this so-called change of tone that we've seen from the Pope there?
Well, let's take your second point first, Brendan. I think it's been the American clergy are disappointed effectively because he's calling them out and making very clear how misguided their own priorities have been. I also want to come back to something that Peter was saying earlier in terms of the confessional as a message of salvation. He's absolutely right. That is what the Pope was saying. But he was not saying the confessional is there for people who are gay Catholics or divorced Catholics. The confessional is there for all of us, and without distinguishing between anybody. That's important because there has been a tendency by too many people to focus on specific groups of people who are identified as sinners, when in fact in Catholic theology we are all sinners. Now, in terms of what I think it was Kate was saying, yes, I agree completely, and as a gay Catholic, obviously, I yearn for a fundamental change. I yearn for a change not only on homosexuality, but also on contraception and on a whole range of other things. But I think what is important in what Pope Francis has been saying is that it paves the way for that. One of the ways it does so is by encouraging listening, encouraging open and frank discussion. Now, on all these issues, contraception, masturbation, divorce, homosexuality, cohabitation before marriage, on all of these issues, we know from scientific research that most Catholics, in fact, disagree with the CDF doctrine.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're analysing the comments of Pope Francis with Peter Williams, Iman Abou Atta, Terrence Weldon, Susy Hodges and Kate Smurthwaite. And what do you make of that, Peter? Because I read some statistics, something like 82% of Catholics say birth control is morally acceptable. Are these simply cafeteria Catholics that just pick and choose what suits them?
Well, they're certainly grievously inconsistent. I mean, the thing is, how do you define a Catholic? The way the Church defines a Catholic is anyone who's baptised. And of course, you can be as unpracticing or as practicing as you like being a baptised person. I mean, Richard Dawkins was baptised as an Anglican. It doesn't make him a practicing Anglican.
He'd call himself a cultural Anglican, though.
He could call himself a cultural Anglican, but in Catholicism, practicing Catholicism is actually really living the faith. That's what we mean by Catholic in the truest sense. But of course, you're Catholic just by being baptised. So if you have a poll of people who are Catholic and they say, well, I agree with birth control, all you're really telling us is how many people have fallen away from a practice of the faith. And that's quite a large number of people over time. But, what the Pope was saying was he wasn't raising up a discussion about any of these kind of issues. It's really a mistake to try to read into the Pope's comments or try to think about the Church's teaching on homosexuality or as you say, masturbation or adultery or anything like that. He actually says, look, the teaching of the Church is clear on this point and I am a loyal son of the Church. He makes it very clear he has absolutely no intention of changing the teaching of the Church, nor could he, because the Church's teaching is so consistent over time for 2,000 years. What we call the ordinary magisterium of the Church's teaching is therefore infallible. It's totally unchangeable. But this is not bigotry, as Kate put it. I mean, but it's not about prejudice. There's nothing prejudiced towards people who are same-sex attracted by saying we don't believe that sexual acts between men or between women are wrong. What you're saying is, actually, this is something which does not go into God's plan. It's something which isn't rightly ordered into the order of our sexuality. And the Church witnesses to that. But it's not as if we talk about this all the time, it's the most important thing. There are many more important things in Catholicism and Christianity than what we do with our genitals.
More broadly, though, the question I want to bring in, Terry, again, is, I suppose, for a lot of people, it's not necessarily what the Pope believes, but which parts he emphasises and which parts he ignores. And there is a feeling that he is concentrating more on things like social justice, poverty, and less on issues such as abortion and gay marriage. And I want to know what you think of that.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I'm completely fascinated that in a wide-ranging interview where the Pope himself made it clear that the Church is too focused on the sexual issues, that Peter, in talking about that interview, precisely brings in and focuses on the sexual issues. That is not what we should be talking about. The second thing I want to say in terms of what the Pope actually said is that he contradicted what Peter has just been saying about the constant and unchanging tradition of the Church. That was a phrase that Pope Benedict regularly used, but in fact it's a complete myth. The teaching of the Church has constantly changed. And Pope Francis, in fact, made that clear in what he was saying towards the end of his interview. Before replying to the question, he turned to his breviary and he quoted from what was obviously one of his favourite sections, a writer who referred to the need for Church dogma, not even doctrine or teaching, but dogma, a very strong word. Pope Francis quoted a reference to the fact that the Church dogma must be open to change over the years for the very simple reason that humans' understanding of our world and of ourselves is constantly evolving. And Pope Francis said clearly we need to recognize that and we need to be open to that change. Now, couple of simple examples of how church teaching in fact has changed. I really don't want to get into the detail of gay marriage, but it's a perfect illustration of how church teaching has changed there. In the very early church, marriage was seen as a consummation and a reflection of God's union with his people. It was not seen as a means to procreation, and in fact many of the church fathers taught that even in marriage sex was inappropriate and was inferior to total celibacy. The Origen, one of the renowned early church fathers, castrated himself because he did not want to produce children. Tertullian, again one of the great fathers of the church, taught that the sexual urge, those who want to procreate were mistaken. Even much later, under the Council of Trent, the Roman Catechism, the forerunner of the modern Catechism, has a line in it which states that there was once a need for the world to procreate and for population growth, but now that the world is fully populated, we no longer have that need. The church teaching on marriage and procreation has changed constantly across 2 million.
The point is the church has never changed its teaching on any of these things. Certainly there have been different discussions and there's certainly a lot of latitude for discussions on minor issues, but when it comes to, for example, the righteousness of sexual acts between men or between women, or when it comes to sex outside marriage or anything like that, the church's teaching has been absolutely constant, has never changed. And what Pope Francis was actually saying, because I actually have the interview in front of me rather helpfully. What he was actually talking about was St. Vincent of Lorraine, who makes a discussion of the development of doctrine. Not the change, not a thing from one to the other. The whole idea of development is that it evolves but stays exactly the same as well.
Cannot
it's like an
evolve
acorn
and stay the same.
Well, it does. For example, Marian doctrines. Marian doctrines, the Mary was the mother of God, has always been something we believe.
Okay.
But yet, we also have developed the idea of her Assumption and her Immaculate Conception. These are things that go back, but are defined more and more over time. That's not something that means that you can change from one thing into another.
Peter, can we move on to just some of the other comments that he made, not necessarily in this interview? And I do want to bring in Susy and Kate on this particularly, but first of all, Iman, the point of what he said, well, his direct quote, God's mercy does not have limits, and therefore it reaches non-believers too, for whom sin would not be the lack of faith in God, but rather the failure to obey one's conscience. Now, agnostics and atheists have said, well, look, this is perhaps... this is a change of tack, because this suggests that we don't have to necessarily follow his faith, but salvation is there for others. I mean, I'm just interested in what your view of what he had to say.
I totally agree with what he said, because it's the way you run your life, the way you're behaving, it's the way you deal with your life on a daily basis, more than whether you really believe in God, or you might have different gods, you might not believe in any God whatsoever. But it's about really your acts and your conscience and how you're acting. And it's about the submission to anything that you believe in, but it's more about your behavior and your way of life. You might be practicing, whether you're a practicing Catholic going to the church every Sunday, and you might be a practicing Muslim going to the mosque every Friday, and you're doing sins left, right, and center. And you might be someone who does not believe in God, does not go to any institution whatsoever, and you're someone who's totally going on within your conscience, doing things perfectly well and treating people nicely and living your life in a good way.
But your group Faith Matters represents different faiths, and I appreciate that. But faiths that one could describe them as monolithic faiths that believe that they have the monopoly on the truth. In terms of what the Pope has said, I mean, this has opened the floodgates, perhaps.
It's really rather inaccurate, those remarks about Pope Francis saying to atheists, you don't have to believe in God to go to heaven. It really got rather distorted and misinterpreted in the press, and then went sort of viral in the blogosphere. He said that, God's mercy has no limits if he who asks for mercy does so in contrition and with a sincere heart, i.e. come to faith, come to the church. So a lot of people, took that to believe that it meant everybody. But
so the media have got that wrong, have they, Susy?
Yes. Yes, they have. They have. That he hasn't otherwise, because that would have been a major overturning of, Catholic teaching. They've got it wrong. He didn't go as far as saying that, but he did sort of. Obviously, what he said was a change of tone. He's recognising there's good and positive even in people who are atheists.
Can I get the view of Kate Smurthwaite, who is an atheist? What did you make of his comments?
Oh, wow. Well, that's brilliant. So the chief leader of something I definitely don't believe in and think is a load of nonsense thinks that there's even good in somebody like me who goes around doing tons of charity work and is making enormous efforts, does a lot of stuff that's very positive. And, how benevolent of him to have offered me the crumbs from his table. The reality is atheists don't want to be told that they can still be a part of the Catholic Church because they're atheists. They don't want to be a part of the Catholic Church. They're a part of something else. And what is really interesting is what he seems to be saying is that, people outside of the church can still have their own consciousness and their own sense of morality. And you have to ask the question, if he really thinks that, what's the point of being in the church? Why bother following all these weird rules if it's just as good to follow what your own conscience tells you? And interestingly, certainly my own conscience would tell me to do lots of things that the Catholic Church would be very much against, but which I can clearly see, are actually good for the benefit of humanity. So, for example, providing contraception and condoms to areas where there's a high incidence of sexual disease. I know we're back on sex again, but similarly, providing contraception enables women to raise themselves and their families out of poverty, and I can see that that's obviously a good thing to do. If he's going to suggest, you are allowed to follow your own conscience, then maybe people will be much better off following their own conscience. It's interesting that Peter keeps insisting that doctrine hasn't changed. Perhaps he'd like to comment on what the Church's view on slavery remains.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're analysing the comments of Pope Francis with Peter Williams, Iman Abou Atta, Terrence Weldon, Susy Hodges and Kate Smurthwaite. Well, actually, I'll bring in Peter, but a lot are saying that the Pope is saying it doesn't matter what you believe about Jesus as long as you are a good person. Is that a bit too simplistic? Is that
it is
a bit
very
too
simplistic, because when you actually, again, read his comments, and this is one of the things people don't seem to want to do, he actually said, look, first of all, you ask if the God of the Christians forgives those who do not believe and do not seek faith. Given that, and this is fundamental, God's mercy has no limits if he who asks for mercy does so in contrition and with a sincere heart, right? That's what he's talking about when it comes to salvation. In other words, doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter if you're an atheist, doesn't matter if you're a Muslim, doesn't matter if you're a Christian, doesn't matter if you're whatever. If you come to God with a sincere and contrite heart, then he offers forgiveness. The issue for those who don't believe in God isn't obeying their conscience. What he's talking about there is meeting people in dialogue. When we meet each other in dialogue, when we talk about peace, which is what he goes on to talk about, people have to meet each other by doing good. And we kind of all have this natural law written on our heart, is something which Catholics do believe. And that natural law allows us to know what is and what is good.
But that the version of conscience isn't in keeping with the conversion culture of Catholicism over the centuries.
Well,
it is conversion upon pain of death. We're saving your soul.
The whole point
this
of
is completely different.
not at all, because the whole point of conscience is that it has to be informed. And when you do inform your conscience properly, it is assumed by Catholics you will become a Catholic, because Catholicism is the fullness of the truth. Incidentally, just have to say to Kate, he wasn't talking to you. He was talking to Dr. Eugenio Scalfari, who's an atheist commentator in Italy. So yes, you might find it completely irrelevant, but Dr. Eugenio Scalfari, writing in La Repubblica, evidently did want an answer to his questions, and he got one.
So you talk about, atheists can come to, as long as they come to God in contrition and sincerely and all this sort of stuff. How can I go to God sincerely when I've got a GCSE in science and I know that he doesn't exist?
Because science doesn't tell you that God doesn't exist, and anyone who knows anything about science can tell you that. It's utterly naive nonsense to try to suggest that if someone has a GCSE in science, they know that God does not exist.
Okay, look,
that's a simplistic nonsense.
But I think it should be a basic fundamental axiom, shouldn't it, really?
Peter, we're not going to conclude whether or not God exists in this discussion, but Terry, I just want to get Terry's view on those comments. Did you think that this was perhaps him opening his arms to those who don't follow the Catholic faith?
I really don't want to speak in any way for or about people who are not themselves Catholics. However, I do want to pick up on this whole concept of conscience, which is crucially important. It's particularly important for people like myself who are gay or lesbian, because the only way we can reconcile our lives inside the church is by paying very close attention to what conscience means and what it doesn't mean. I think Peter will agree with me that speaking about conscience does not give us some kind of carte blanche to simply do what we want. It is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. It is not license to do what we choose to do.
Amen.
Conscience must be informed. However, on the other side, on the other extreme, we have people who would like to pretend or to claim that in order to be properly informed, conscience must be dictated to by the catechism, and that in fact all you have to do to have an informed conscience is to memorize the catechism and do everything that it says. There is a problem there, because for gay people there are inherent contradictions inside the catechism about sexuality, which I won't go in now, but there are clear contradictions. The only way we can resolve those is by conscience. And what Pope Francis was saying, and I think this is so important, yes, conscience must be informed. Conscience must learn from the hierarchy of the church. It must not be dictated to by the hierarchy. And throughout his interview, there is a recognition that there are dangers in any attempt at certainty and dogmatism. We have to recognize, whoever we are, whatever our starting point, that we may be wrong. And not only that we may be wrong, that others may be wrong. We must be open to that possibility.
That's why we have to be open to dialogue, which is really what the Holy Father was talking about when he talked about atheism and conscience. That if everyone follows their conscience and everyone tries to do good, then we have a mutual intentionality there, whereby we can meet and engage in dialogue together, whether in our good works and in our search for truth. And obviously, whilst I don't grant that there are any inherent contradictions within church teaching, I do think that if we enter into dialogue, or any of us enter into a conversation, then we can come to that truth through the use of our God-given reason.
Okay, back to you, Kate.
Sorry, so here's the thing, Peter, is you say that atheists who are searching to, follow their conscience and do what's good are doing the same thing, as Catholics and people of other religions maybe, who are seeking to do what's best. But in actual fact, as a Catholic, the way that you've expressed yourself, you're not seeking to do what's best. You're seeking to do what the church teaches letter for letter. You're not seeking what your conscience tells you is right and is best. You're seeking what the church orders you to do. And that's a very different thing. And in
No,
actual fact,
actually
it
not.
leaves you operating in a very different way.
Well,
And,
unfortunately, that's a total caricature, as often is given, a total caricature of what actually happens in a Catholic conscience. In my conscience, I was an atheist. I became a Catholic over time, and the reason I became a Catholic is because I believe that Catholicism is true. And it's because I believe Catholicism is true that I practice it. If I ever cease to believe that, I will no longer be a Catholic. I will say, right, no, forget the catechism. I don't allow someone to just dictate to me blindly what I should believe. I say the reason I actually follow the Church's teachings is because whenever I look at a church teaching, I consistently see that it is true, based on reason and evidence. And we can have that discussion, but the thing is, we can have the discussion. That's the whole point. But there is a commonality between all of us, whereby we have reason in common. That's how we can come to truth.
If I can come in here, one simple observation. Peter has just referred to the Catholic teaching based on reason and evidence. Benedict, again, often spoke about the importance of faith and reason. The problem for me, in terms of sexual teaching and in some other areas, is that the simple fact of the matter is that in so many areas, the Vatican disregards the evidence. You cannot have reason without basic premises, and the premises on which so much of teaching has been founded are flawed. We really need to take seriously the Church's own observation that we must pay due attention and take careful consideration of the findings of science, natural science, social science, and the findings of social surveys. All of that is part of Catholic teaching, and in fact they do not follow it.
I do think they do, actually.
Kate, what did you want to say?
It is absolutely ridiculous for anybody on here to be talking about the interaction between faith and reason. Faith, by definition, is throwing out reason. Faith is the opposite of reason. So to talk about the alliance between them, or about religion directing you, if religion tells you to go and study the science and study reason, at the end of that research you'll discover that faith is a lie and that there is no deity out there, and that will be
it may not be a requirement to be illiterate about religion and theology to be a member of the SSS, but clearly it helps, because clearly faith does not mean simply believing blindly. Faith means believing based on rational trust in something.
Okay, Kate, you made your point. Peter, you've made your point quite strongly. I just want to quickly get the view of Susy Hodges in Rome. Another clear headline grabber was the Pope's Deputy Secretary of State, Pietro Parolin, who said that the principle of celibacy among the clergy was ecclesiastical tradition rather than church dogma, and therefore open to discussion. I just want to get your view on what that means and what you think will happen on that.
Well, it's true, of course. It's not set down in dogma, and as probably everybody knows, for the first, 1,000 years or so, clergy were married. So if any church teaching were to change, that would be perhaps one of the easier ones to change. Now, having said that, we can't read too much into that, but, on the other hand, we'll just have to wait and see whether Pope Francis has, got other changes, or has got changes up his sleeve, but so far, as we said, he hasn't made any changes.
Okay, and just finally, Iman Abou Atta from Faith Matters. I read one piece in the Washington Post that made the point that it described Pope Francis as a liberal Christian trapped in a conservative Christian body, namely the Catholic Church. I just want to get your view. Would you agree with that 6 months into his tenure at the helm of the Catholic Church, or is it too early to tell?
I think it's too early to tell. All I can say is that I think he's opening up to the world, as being more inclusive on so many things and so many social issues. He's targeting and maybe addressing other beliefs and other faiths out there and trying to include everyone. And that's not only, I think, in his role representing the Vatican, but as well in the whole sense of Christianity and what's happening currently in Europe.
Terry, what do you make of that point by the Washington Post? A liberal pope, they've called him effectively.
I don't think he's a liberal pope in terms of being a progressive pope, but he's also not a conservative pope, and he says that very clearly. I think he's a middle-of-the-road pope, but he is liberal in the sense of being open to others, open to other ideas. And getting back to the question of the priesthood, what the most important thing, I think, in the Secretary of State's words was that it is open for discussion. Under Benedict, it wasn't open for discussion, and so much was not open for discussion. Nowadays, I think under Francis, so much is open for discussion, and that is crucially important.
And that's a good place to close the discussion. Thank you very much. That's Terry Weldon, an activist and author of the blog Queering the Church. Also here in the studio, Peter D. Williams, Speaker of Catholic Voices, and Iman Abou Atta, Deputy Director of Faith Matters. That's our guests in the studio. On the line, Kate Smurthwaite, an atheist, activist and comedian, and Susy Hodges, an expert on Vatican affairs based in Rome. Thank you all very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.